Chapter 9. Ted called me from Nampa, Idaho, to tell me he loved me. We had picnicked there on one of our trips to Utah. He called me again from outside of Salt Lake City to tell me where he was, and he called me from his apartment to tell me how much he loved the place I had found for him. We talked several hours a week, running up huge phone bills. Mid-September 1974. The bodies of the two young women who had disappeared from Lake Sammamish were found in the woods not far from the lake. According to the newspaper accounts, there were no clues and the police were still baffled. I told Ted about it, listening for some sort of reaction, but hearing none. The next time we talked, he asked me if any more bodies had been found. His bringing it up like that scared the hell out of me. In late October, I picked up Angie at the airport as she was returning from a trip to Utah. She seemed upset, but she waited until we were alone in the car to tell me what was wrong. "I don't want to scare you," she said, "but it's happening in Utah right now." I stared at her. I knew exactly what she meant. When my mom was driving me to the airport, she said, I heard it on the radio. Deer hunters found the body of the daughter of the Midvale police chief. She'd been missing, just like the girls up here. Tomorrow morning I would have to call the police. I had fixed a dinner for Angie, but neither of us could eat. I drank the bottle of wine I'd bought and was awake most of the night. I visualized Ted and me married. He would be campaigning for governor when it was revealed that his devoted wife had gone to the police in 1974, claiming that he was a murderer. The next morning, I waited until everyone else in my department had gone on break, and then I called the King County Police. Major crimes. Hersheimer. I'd like to talk to someone who knows about the missing women cases. I was shaking and my voice was high and strained. I can help you, he said. Even though I had rehearsed this 100 times during the night, I didn't know how to begin. I'm scared that a friend of mine is involved. I know I'm wrong, but there are some coincidences. My friend moved away and the crime stopped, and now where he lives, the same kind of thing is happening. Most of the time I think I'm crazy, but then I get scared that I'm right. I wanted to be businesslike and concise, but here I was, rattled, talking about being crazy. Let's start at the beginning. What's your friend's name? I paused. I'd been at this point before. I really don't want to say. I know you can't do much without his name, but it's just that I'm probably wrong. I understand. It makes my job harder, but not impossible. What are the coincidences that you're worried about? He understood. I told him about the experience I'd had when I called the Seattle police. My friend drives a Volkswagen, but it's not metallic. Sometimes he speaks in a formal way that could be mistaken for an accent, and his first name is Ted. The detective's reaction was milder than I expected. He wanted to know why I had called the Seattle police. I told him about seeing the crutches in my friend's room. He wanted to know what was significant about that. I was amazed. Didn't he know that a man on crutches had been connected with the George Ann Hawkins case? Then you've been worried for a long time, he said. Yes, it's been so awful. I know I'm wrong, but I can't stop thinking about it. He pressed me for more. Why was I calling him today? I told him what Angie had heard on the radio and that my friend had moved to Salt Lake City in September. What is your relationship with your friend? He asked. Well, we've gone together for 5 years, I said. I was getting worried about people coming back to the office. I told him I couldn't talk much longer. What's the next step? He wanted to know. I think in order to put your fears to rest, we need to pursue this further. Could you call Salt Lake City and find out what's going on there? Maybe it isn't similar at all. Maybe they've made an arrest already. I'll do that. What's your phone number and I'll call you back? No, I'll call you back, I said. I was getting panicky. Well, what's your name? I need to know who's calling me back. I want to tell you that you're not the first girlfriend who's called about her boyfriend. They all felt about as bad as you do, but after we checked the guys out, the women were tremendously relieved. I told him my name was Liz. Okay, Liz, you are for sure going to call me back, right? It's important that you call back. Give me an hour. My name is Randy Hershmeyer. Promise me that you'll call back in an hour. Feeling like I was 6 years old, I solemnly promised to call him back in an hour. I just had time to call Angie before people drifted back to the office. She was leaving in a few days for Europe. I called Hershmeyer back in 2 hours. I thought you had changed your mind, he said. I got real busy here, I lied. I had watched every move of the minute hand on the clock for the last 2 hours. Well, I called Salt Lake City, he said, and told me only what Angie had heard on the radio about the body being found. Let's talk about your friend some more, he said, and I told him I would call back at lunchtime. I went looking for the most out-of-the-way payphone I could find. It was by itself on the mezzanine outside a large auditorium. I called the detective back. He told me that right after the Lake Sammamish disappearances, the police had done a massive study of VW owners named Ted. There are more of them than you might think, he said. What else made you worry about your friend? I told him about Ted going to Lake Sammamish the weekend of July 7th. I go there a lot myself, he said. I've never been there before, I answered, and I don't think Ted had gone there before either. But that wasn't enough to make you worry, was it? Is your boyfriend violent? What really started you going on this thing? I told him about the composite picture in my first anonymous call to the TED hotline. It was hard for me to put the bits and pieces together in any way that would be sensible. I said that the 2 of the earlier disappearances had happened in my own neighborhood in the University District. Where did your boyfriend live? When I told him it was the U District, he quickly asked me if my friend's name, Ted, was short for Edward. No, it's short for Theodore, I said. You don't mean, I could hear him shuffling papers, Theodore R. Bundy? I was stunned. How do you know that? We checked him out last summer when his name was called in to the task force. By who? A university professor. So Ted had already been checked out. I was at once relieved that I'd been worrying for nothing and indignant that anyone else would suspect my Ted of these horrible crimes. I still think we should get together, Hirschmeyer said. Would you come down here to talk to me? No, I was emphatic. Would you meet me somewhere in the U District? Say Herfy's? He went on, naming a popular hamburger place. I hesitated. You sound like you've been pretty upset by your worries. Discussing them with me can put an end to them once and for all. I agreed to meet him in the Herfy's parking lot. After I hung up, I went into the ladies' room. The mirror confirmed what I felt, the worst case of blotches I had ever had. We had gone through a long thing on the phone about how we would recognize each other, but I spotted him immediately that evening because he looked exactly like a detective sitting in a detective's unmarked car waiting for someone. He had a stack of papers on the seat with an enlargement of Ted's driver's license photo on top. We sat in Hirschmeyer's car and I asked him about the police checking Ted out earlier. I felt somehow tricked. He picked up Ted's picture and said, "This is proof. I couldn't have got it since you called this morning. We got it last summer." We went back over everything: height, weight, hair color, the accent, the VW, the expensive-looking tennis clothes, whether Ted had a sailboat. I told him I had been with Ted that morning and the evening of July 14th. He told me that when they checked Ted out, they found he had never been in trouble with the law and seemed to be clean in every way. I hesitated and then I began, "That's just it. There is a side to Ted that only I know. You see, he steals." Hersheimer kept looking at me as if I hadn't finished my sentence. I mean, he gets all dressed up in his fine clothes and then he shoplifts. He's taken everything from textbooks to a TV. I felt stupid. Hirschmeyer was trying to catch a murderer, not a thief. I went on. Sometimes I think that Ted enjoys the con of stealing things more than the stuff he stole. One of the few times I've ever seen him lose his temper was when I dropped over to his room and he had a new TV and a new stereo and a bunch of stuff I knew he couldn't afford. I was shocked and I told him he was nothing but a thief. He told me that if I ever told anyone, he would break my fucking neck. Does he have a violent temper? Did he put his hands on you when he threatened you? Did he ever hit you? I was embarrassed, but I told Hersheimer about the only time Ted had hit me. It was early in our relationship and I was drunk. I couldn't remember what we were arguing about, but I kept telling Ted to go ahead and hit me. Go ahead. Finally, he had slapped me. Ironically, it had happened in this very same Herfy's parking lot. Hersheimer asked me if there was anything in Ted's background that would affect the way he felt about women. I told him that Ted was illegitimate and that he had been upset because his mom had never discussed it with him, but that he was still close to his mom and his brothers and sisters. Then, looking straight into my eyes, Hershmeyer said, "What about your sex life?" "Oh, we've had our ups and downs, so to speak." I was trying to cover my nervousness by being funny, but my face was beginning to flush. "We've had a pretty good sex life up until last summer, I guess. Then Ted just lost all interest in sex. He was under a lot of pressure with his job and moving and all. Maybe he had another girlfriend. I don't know." "I know this is hard for you, but it's important," he said. "How often? What positions? When? Where?" I didn't even talk about these things with Angie, but I told myself that this guy was a police officer. He'd heard it all before. I told him that in the fall of 1973, Ted had brought a copy of a book called The Joy of Sex to my house. We had lain in bed and read through it. Ted sheepishly asked me if we could try bondage. I said sure, never dreaming that a year later I'd be sitting in a car telling a stranger about it. We'd had sex that way maybe 3 times, but I didn't like it, so we stopped. I tried to convince Hirschmeyer that there was nothing unnatural about the way we made love. Had Ted ever had any homosexual experiences that I knew about? None, but during the past year he had talked about anal sex enough to make me wonder. Had we had anal sex? No, never. I couldn't think of anything less appealing. Hirschmeyer pulled out a piece of paper and asked me to look at it. It was a psychological profile, a list of characteristics that a psychiatrist thought the killer would possess. I read down the list. Ted didn't even come remotely close to fitting it. When I came to the line that said the killer probably hated animals and had a history of cruelty to them, I thought about all the strays Ted had brought to my house, the hamsters and guinea pigs and kittens he had given Tina. Hirschmeyer told me flatly that Ted didn't look like a suspect. He told me about a man he had investigated recently. Everything about him fit what the police were looking for, and they spent a lot of time checking the guy out. When they picked him up, it turned out that he had an airtight alibi. He was on a fishing boat off Alaska on the day of the disappearances from Lake Sammamish. Hirschmeyer's frustrations were apparent in his voice. He talked about how much pressure there had been to solve the case, pressure from the public and pressure from his superiors. I really wished I could somehow help him. He asked me if I would give him some recent pictures of Ted, so as a final check he could show them to the witnesses from Lake Sammamish. I hesitated. Pictures would be concrete proof that I had called the police. I thought of my waking dream the night before about Ted's campaign for governor. I tried to explain how I felt about giving him the pictures. He seemed to be getting annoyed with my ambivalence. It was getting late. He probably wanted to get home. I told him yes, he could have the pictures. As he started his car, he turned to me and said, "Now you've told me absolutely everything that's been bothering you, right?" I bit my lip. I didn't know if I should bring up one last thing. He persuaded me that giving him almost all the information I had would clear up almost all of my questions. If I wanted to totally be done with this, I would have to be 100% honest with him. So I told him about the plaster of Paris I had found in Ted's desk drawer several years ago, and Ted's comment that you could never tell when you'll break your leg. We drove the 6 blocks from Herfy's to my place in silence. It was past Tina's bedtime, but she was still up with the babysitter. I introduced the detective as my friend and tucked Tina in, then walked the babysitter home to the end of the block. Neither of us liked walking down the dark street, but tonight, knowing there was a policeman in my living room, I felt safe. When I got back, we started flipping through photo albums. He told me he thought Tina was a real cute kid and asked me how she got along with Ted. I told him how lucky I felt that she and Ted cared so much for each other. The albums were proof. A 3-year-old riding on his shoulders, a 5-year-old held up on her new bike, an 8-year-old held upside down by him. I wanted to tell Hirschmeyer about all the trips, the dinners, everything we shared, but I knew he didn't care. He picked up 3 snapshots and then pulled out a report form. His manner was businesslike. "Spell your name, give me your address. How old are you?" I was tired. It seemed to take him forever to write down the things we talked about at Herfy's. At last he was ready to go. "I'll let you know about the witnesses and what they say as soon as I show them the pictures," he said on his way out the door. I called Angie and we talked into the night. I felt guilty and I felt relieved. She was leaving the next day for Europe and was upset about leaving me with so many worries, but she gave me an address in Paris, as if she could do anything from halfway around the world. A week later, my parents came for a visit. I tried to dazzle them with how well I was doing. I chatted about becoming involved with the University District Community Council and getting chosen for the board right away. I had accepted a church job that was keeping me busy. I rambled on about the night class I was taking. What I didn't tell them was that I had lost control of my mind and couldn't sleep at night unless I was drunk. Ted called several times that week. It was easy for me not to think about having gone to the police when I was talking with him. He was just Ted, nothing else. It was after I hung up that I was consumed by guilt and hoped to God he never found out. I expected to hear from Hirschmeyer right away. When almost a week had gone by with no word, I called him again from my same payphone phone on the mezzanine. "Hi, this is Liz. Have you shown the pictures to the Lake Sammamish witnesses yet?" "What pictures?" he asked. "The pictures of Ted Bundy." "Who is this again?" he asked, sounding irritated. "This is Liz Kendall. I talked to you last week in the Herfy's parking lot." I had told this man the most intimate details of my life, and he couldn't remember who I was. "I gave you 3 snapshots, and you were going to show them to the witnesses from Lake Sammamish and call me back?" "Oh, yeah, I haven't had a chance to show them to the most reliable witness. I haven't been able to get a hold of her. Like I told you, I'll call you when I do." More days went by without a word from Hirschmeyer. I decided to call him again. In my imagination, I could hear him say things like, "Don't call here anymore," or, "You're the one who ought to be locked up, lady. You're the one with the problem." As it turned out, he was on vacation. One day I called a woman I barely knew and asked her if she would join me at the afternoon break. I was so lonely. As we got our coffee, she suggested we join her boyfriend and his friends from the prosthetics and orthotics lab in the hospital. On the way back to our offices, she said to me, "You notice that good-looking guy named Jim? The reason I didn't use his last name when I introduced you is that he's Jim Ott. His wife Jan was murdered out by Lake Sammamish." A terrible chill swept over me. I knew who had murdered his wife. Oh my God, was I responsible? I had done the only thing I knew to do. I had gone to the police. It was out of my hands now. Weeks later, I remembered that my ski rack was on Ted's car on July 14th. Was that what had happened to Janice Ott's bicycle? Finally, Hirschmeyer called me. He had shown the pictures to his best witness. He explained to me that a stack of photos is given to the witness and that she goes through them one by one. When she came to one of Ted, she pulled it out of the stack and balanced it on her knee. When she was finished, she took Ted's picture and put it back in the stack. The man was too old, she explained. "That's hardly a positive ID," Hirschheimer said. "What does that mean?" "I don't know what it means to you," he said, "but to me it means I'm going to put Ted Bundy in my done it twice file and file him away." Chapter 10. Around Thanksgiving, a young housewife named Vonnie Smith vanished from her home in the south end of Seattle. My first reaction was relief. Ted was in Salt Lake City, but almost immediately the police announced that they had a suspect and that the Stuth case was not related to the Ted murders. I was trying to get on with my life as best I could, but it was hard. For my night class, I was supposed to write a term paper based on research done in newspapers. As I headed for the newspaper reading room in the downtown public library, I knew that I would read the Salt Lake Tribune while I was there. Maybe the crime in Salt Lake had been solved. As I browsed through the Tribune, I found myself reading about the Utah political scene and how the college football teams were doing. Then I came to the first article about the discovery of the body of Melissa Smith, the killing Angie had told me about. The article said that Smith, the daughter of Midvale's police chief, had been missing since the evening of October 18th. That was the day before my dad's birthday, and my dad had spent his birthday deer hunting with Ted. Ted had called me several times on the 18th. He had never been hunting before, and he was excited about it. I started going through papers more rapidly, looking for more details. I was stunned by what I found next. On November 8th, a young woman had been abducted from a shopping mall by a man posing as a police officer. The woman had escaped from the man's Volkswagen as he tried to handcuff her. The man had struggled with the woman, had managed to get the handcuffs on one wrist, and had tried to hit her with a crowbar, but she managed to get away. Later that night, a young woman named Debbie Kent disappeared from a high school parking lot in Bountiful, Utah, 30 miles north of the attack on the first young woman. The police had found a key in the high school lot that fit the handcuffs attached to the first woman's wrist. "Get up," I told myself. "Get up and go see your bishop." By the time I got to the church, I was detached from the horror I had felt at the library, but when I entered the bishop's office and shook his hand, I came unglued. I had been trying for so long to maintain a calm and poised facade, to at least look normal from the outside. Now I sat in front of my bishop, sobbing and wringing my hands. He listened patiently, trying to make sense out of my story as I jumped back and forth. I kept telling him that I thought I was persecuting Ted and I didn't know why. In a calming voice, my bishop began talking to me about decisions. He told me that he sometimes agonized over simple ones and had learned that the only way to get peace of mind was to make a decision, take it to the Lord, and if it was a right decision, I would feel a confirmation in my heart. I explained to him how intensely I had prayed to know what was right and what I should do. "God gave you free agency. You have to exercise it accordingly," he told me. "That's just it," I told him. "I am trying to do what's right. I thought I had to go to the police, but when they told me I was wrong, I was still scared. At the library, I felt like claws were tearing my soul to shreds." "I think the police should be made aware of what you read in the papers," he said. "Give them the burden. They will know whether it bears pursuing." "I can't call them again. They've already checked Ted out twice. They think I'm a hysterical nut out to get my boyfriend." "Do you want me to call them?" he asked. Relief swept over me. I gave him Hirschmeyer's number and went home to start my nightly ritual of drinking myself to sleep. I knew the bishop would be disappointed if he could see me, but what else could I do? While I was having my first drink, I got out a calendar and looked at the date of the attempted abduction by the man in the Volkswagen, November 8th, a Friday. That was the day my parents had left Seattle to go home. Ted had called me late that night. I tried to reach out to him earlier, but there was no answer. I had fallen asleep on the couch, and when he had called, I had a hard time waking up. He had gotten impatient with me and almost hung up. I kept saying, wait a minute, and then when he waited, I had nothing to say. He said to call him in the morning. It was about 11 p.m. here, so would have been midnight in Utah. That was almost proof that he hadn't been out abducting women that night, wasn't it? My bishop called me at work the next morning. He had told Hirschmeyer how upset I was by what I read in the Salt Lake papers and suggested that authorities in Utah be contacted. Hirschmeyer agreed to call Utah and let me know. Time dragged on. My bishop called a second time and there was still no word. At last I called Hirschmeyer myself. He told me that people in King County had been so busy killing each other off that he hadn't had time to call Salt Lake City. Christmas was coming and I was going home to Utah as usual. I could no longer get a whole night's sleep. I would wake up about 2 or 3 in the morning and toss and turn until the sun came up. I sometimes wondered if I was possessed. As the sleepless nights stacked up, my mental state got worse. I was afraid I would be murdered in Utah. I could visualize Ted finding out that I knew the truth. He will murder me, I thought, but first he will murder Tina in front of me and then my mother and father. During one awful night, I decided that I would call my dad. He had friends on various police forces. Maybe he could help me. I waited until it was 6 a.m. in Utah. Maybe he would be up by then. His groggy voice told me he'd been asleep. Hello, Dad. This is Liz. I need help. I'm scared that maybe Ted's involved in those murders in Utah. I wondered if maybe you could discreetly contact someone on the police force and they could check him out. There was total silence on the other end of the line. I thought maybe he'd gone back to sleep. But then, sounding absolutely appalled, he asked me why I would think such a thing. I fumbled to explain. He listened, and when I was done, there was another long silence. You have to be absolutely certain before you contact the police, he said. You would ruin his career if you were mistaken. Are you sure? When I said no, he declined to get involved and we hung up. I got out of bed and plugged in the Christmas tree lights. I wrapped myself up in the afghan my mom had made for me. I sat in the rocking chair that had been my grandma's and stared at the lights on the tree. As our plane circled over Salt Lake City, I was numb from lack of sleep. Ted was going to meet us and drive us to Ogden, but when we walked into the terminal, he wasn't in sight. Late as usual, I told myself. Then suddenly he was there. He threw his arms around me and we rocked back and forth. I forgot how good it felt when he hugged me. Then a hug for Tina. Then a hug for me. Then Tina and I hugged each other just to round things out. We walked arm in arm down the concourse. It looks like you brought some extra bags, he said, indicating the dark circles under my eyes. How unkind of you to notice, I said. We both laughed. We collected my real bags, ski poles and boots, and we were off. Before we drove to Ogden, Ted wanted to show me his apartment and the law school and places he hung out. I couldn't have been more relieved sitting next to him in the car, laughing, talking, enjoying his company. I could understand why my dad was so stunned by my early morning phone call. As we walked into Ted's apartment, the phone rang. It was my dad. Are you all right? Oh, yes, I answered. Everything is just fine. The holidays were wonderful. We spent the days going to Ted's favorite places in Salt Lake City. We visited friends and relatives. Once again, I realized what a gift Ted had at being at ease in social situations. I still watched his every move, but what I saw was Ted playing games with Tina, carrying my niece on his shoulders, helping my mom in the kitchen, hardly the actions of a madman. The shadows were lifting, and I thank God for the peace of mind I was beginning to feel. But there were bad times, like the day we went skiing. It started off on a Laurel and Hardy note. We loaded our skis on the back of Ted's VW while it was still in my parents' garage, and when we backed out, the tips of the skis caught on the top of the garage door and pulled the whole ski rack off the car. We looked at each other and laughed. The sophisticated skiers off on a jaunt. We drove to Snowbird, a first-class resort east of Salt Lake City. Unfortunately, it looked as if half of California had come to Snowbird for Christmas break. They'd have to pay me to stand in those lines, Ted said. We decided to have lunch in the lodge and skip the skiing. We had to park in an outer lot, but that was okay because the resort sent big open trucks around to pick people up and take them to the lodge. As we sat down in the truck on a bale of hay, a young, attractive woman started a conversation with Ted. He was so charming, she was soon telling him that she was from California and that she had come to Utah alone to do some skiing. I found myself thinking how easy it would be to trust this man, to go with him and die. I didn't have much to say over lunch. I was fighting those feelings again. Ted was watching a bunch of teenagers horsing around. He dubbed the boy the girls were paying the most attention to the James Dean of Midvale. Midvale was where Melissa Smith had disappeared. Would a time ever come when everything didn't remind me of murder? We drove back to Ted's apartment. I had the urge to rip open his drawers and turn them upside down and pull everything out of the closet so I would know there was nothing there to worry about. Ted had a little blue bottle of liqueur he said a woman who lived downstairs had made. "Here, have a taste," he said, holding the bottle out to me. "No thanks," I said. I knew it was a knockout potion. "You'll like it, just have a sample." He walked towards me, holding the bottle in front of him. My mind was racing. "No, I don't want any. I don't trust homemade stuff." "It's okay. She makes it all the time. Here, just smell it." He thrust the bottle under my nose. "I don't want to just smell it," I said, and moved away from him, ready to flee. "Suit yourself," he said, and took a big swig. The problem, as usual, was me. I flew back to Seattle feeling better. My obsessions with murder was gone, leaving as mysteriously as it arrived. Ted would be flying to Seattle in 2 weeks at his semester break. I was genuinely looking forward to having him with me. The first Sunday after I got back, I went in to tell my bishop the good news. My prayers had been answered. He was clearly happy for me, but he still thought I should check with the King County Police to make sure they had notified Salt Lake City. What for? I was irritated. Isn't an answer to a prayer an answer to a prayer? My bishop thought I should stamp out all doubt. Otherwise, it might linger in a corner of my mind and fester, and then, well, it might start all over again. He was probably right, but I knew for sure that I wasn't going to call Hirschmeyer again. This time I was going to call Salt Lake City. I put it off for as long as I could. I was feeling so much better, why stir the pot again? Ted would be here in a couple of days, though, so I'd better get it over with. I slipped away to the same phone booth I'd been using to call Hirschmeyer and called information in Utah for the number of the Salt Lake Homicide Division. I was shaking as much as I had been the first time I called the police. A woman answered. "I'd like to speak to someone who knows about the woman who escaped from a Volkswagen, by a shopping center. Just a moment, please." She put me on hold. "Figure out what you're going to say, for God's sakes," I told myself. Instead, I stared blankly at the dialing instructions on the phone. She came back on the line. "May I ask who's calling?" "Oh, I don't feel I can say, but it's real important." My voice was cracking, and I could feel the tears backing up. "I'm calling from Seattle. I just really need to talk to someone there." She put me on hold again. I rummaged in my purse for a Kleenex. Not only was I crying, but now my nose was running. Great. Just great. I would sound like a sniveling idiot. "Captain Hayward here." I jumped. Then I started one of my long, rambling sentences about my friend and his Volkswagen, and where he lived and where he moved to. Hayward cut me off. "I think we've already investigated him. What is his name?" When I told him, he said, "We looked at him a few months ago when your police up there contacted us. He looked okay. Weren't you just here for a vacation?" How did he know that? Hayward asked me what happened. What happened when? I was confused. "Well, we had a nice vacation," I said. "Nothing seemed wrong." "Then why are you calling today? What's happened?" Well, I was asking myself the same thing. "I was just worried," I said. "Well, don't worry. We checked him out. There's nothing there to lead us to believe he is anything more than just a law student." I finally gave Hayward my name, which of course he must have known, and then I hung up, feeling like a fool. I stared at the phone. It had to be the dirtiest I had ever seen. I hoped I didn't get a disease from it. Then I remembered that I had called Salt Lake City because Hirschmeyer had let me believe that he hadn't. What a creep. As soon as his finals were over, Ted was to catch an evening flight to Seattle, but I got a phone call early that morning. Ted was crying and having a hard time talking. He wasn't happy with himself. I asked if he had bombed out on his finals. "It's not that," he said. "I just can't seem to connect with people. Sure, I can hold doors open for women and smile and be charming, but when it comes to basic relationships, I just don't have it. There's something wrong with me." I wasn't sure what he was telling me. 2 police departments had checked him out 3 times. I wasn't going to get into that again. On the surface, it sounded very much as if he felt bad because he didn't have a girlfriend in Salt Lake City and wanted to cry on my shoulder about it. I wanted him to come to Seattle. "Please come. We can talk." and talk when you're here, and we can hug and hold. You'll feel better, I guarantee it. No, I can't. I just don't think so. We can walk down the Ave and get a sandwich at Jilly's and maybe see the Huskies play basketball. I don't know. I'll call you back, he told me. And he did call back twice. Once to tell me he was coming, the second time to tell me he wasn't. After we talked a bit, he changed his mind again and said he would come. When I picked him up at the airport that night, he was happy and confident. It was hard to believe he had been in the throes of indecision all day. He was carrying a brochure from a ski resort in Aspen. A man sitting next to him on the plane, a salesman for dental equipment, had been on a ski trip to Colorado and had given Ted the brochure. Ted was also carrying late Christmas presents for Tina and me. It was a marvelous visit. I no longer watched his every move, but just enjoyed the things about him that made me love him. At moments I would get cold sweats thinking about what I had done to him by calling the police, but then how would he ever find out? In March 1975, the remains of Linda Healy, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, and Brenda Ball were found, all less than 12 miles from where Jan Ott and Denise Naslund had been found. In April, the unthinkable happened. I turned 30. I had made such a big deal of the onset of old age that I received 5 bouquets of flowers on that day. My house looked like a florist shop. My parents, Ted, my co-workers, the guys who lived upstairs, and a skiing buddy had all tried to ease the transition with flowers. Angie was back from a long trip to Europe and was staying with me temporarily. As she put it, I was another year closer to menopause. What a bummer. I had thought by the time I was 30 I would be happily married and have lots of kids. I had no one to blame but myself, so I had better get on with my life. One day in early June, I straggled into the house after work and found Tina there, all sly grins. She was home by herself for 2 hours each day after school now, and I was pleased with how responsible she was. This day there seemed to be something going on. "Come into my room for a minute," she said. I didn't know what to expect. I couldn't see anything special in her room. Suddenly, 2 arms slipped around me from behind. For a split second, I froze in terror. It was Ted. My knees buckled, and he had to hold me up. "I had no idea you were coming," was all I could say. He and Tina were pleased with themselves and their surprise. "I'm too old for this," I told them. "Please, no more surprises." Ted stayed for almost a week. He had brought his raft, and we went rafting on Green Lake a couple of times. It bothered me that his front license plate was propped up inside the car, but I refused to worry. When Ted said it had fallen off, that was enough for me. Near the end of the visit, Ted called a friend who was going to be driving to Utah in August. He arranged for the friend to bring Ted's little brother to Salt Lake City. When I found out the friend was a woman who had a son about his brother's age, I thought that it was so cozy it stank, and I told him so. "Look," he said, "I didn't drive all the way up here to see her. I came to see you. I love you. You have friends that are men. Can't I have friends who are women?" It was logical and reasonable, but I was still jealous. When Ted would get mad at me, he would tell me that I was insatiable, that no amount of his time or his love would ever be enough for me. I knew he was right, and I spent a lot of time going over and over my life trying to figure out when the plug had been pulled that had left me a hollow shell. Maybe it was in the college years, or maybe it was in my marriage. I prayed to God that I would someday be a whole person, and I still thought the way to do this was to marry Ted. I went back to Utah in late July. I knew that this was the turning point, that Ted and I were going to get married or break up. The first night I was there, Ted and I sat up late at my parents' kitchen table talking and drinking. I asked him if he was still stealing things. When he waffled with a non-answer, I exploded. "You have a great future ahead of you, and you jeopardize it with your stupid actions. Maybe you can't control it. Maybe you're a kleptomaniac." He looked stunned. "The last thing I need is more problems," I went on. "If you got caught stealing, I wouldn't stand by you for a second." "I get so tired of having nothing. You don't understand," he said, "because you've never had to go without." "I've never had to go without because I work hard." I was angry. "I don't go without, but you don't see me furnishing my house with the best of everything." On and on I went, my motor mouth completely out of control. "If you're going to continue to steal, I don't want anything to do with you." The next morning I woke with a hangover, going over the things I'd said. His stealing really did bother me, and I really did mean the things I'd said. I just wished I hadn't been drunk when I said them. Later that day, we drove to Flaming Gorge National Recreation Area in Wyoming to meet the rest of the family who had driven over earlier. I was trying to be cheerful. Ted said, "You know, I don't understand you. One day you act like I make you sick, and the next day you act like everything is fine." I tried to apologize without backing down. I want the best for you, for us, I said. It scares me that you would gamble it all for a few material things. I thought of the gamble I had taken by going to the police. If Ted ever found out, that would be the end of us for sure. At Flaming Gorge, we put our problems aside and enjoyed the sun and scenery. The fishing was terrible. We had been out in the boat for hours and hadn't caught a thing when my mother suddenly shouted, "I've got one! I've got one! Get the net!" Her pole was jerking and bending like there was a 20-pounder on it when Ted bobbed to the surface. He had slipped out of one side of the boat unnoticed, swum under, and grabbed Mom's line. We all laughed about the one that got away. Ted and I had to leave the park early so he could get to work. On the way back, we were talking about how our dads would never stop at scenic viewpoints or points of interest when we were kids, so when we saw a lovely river out in a cow pasture, we stopped the car and hiked over to it. Walking into the trees behind Ted, I was suddenly very scared and had an ominous feeling. The mosquitoes were huge and thick by the water. "Let's go back," I said, swishing the bugs away. "No, come with me." His voice sounded flat and hollow. "Maybe our dads knew something we don't," I said, and turned and hurried back to the car. Would I ever be normal again? The day I was to fly back to Seattle, Ted and I sat on my parents' back lawn and talked about us. I told him that I didn't want to continue this long-distance relationship, that I wanted to get married soon. To my surprise, Ted said, "Let's do it at Christmas time then." We got all excited talking about it and rushed in to tell my parents who were in the kitchen. Our great announcement was met with silence. Ted was devastated. We went for a walk in the foothills. "I thought your parents liked me. I thought they would be happy we were finally going to do it." I was confused. My dad and I had talked once briefly about my early morning phone call to him. I had told him that both the King County and Salt Lake City police had checked Ted out and found nothing. Had Dad told Mom about the call? Was he still worried about Ted? I was so sure the problem was in my head, and now had planted seeds of doubt in my father's head, too. I flew back to Seattle, and the next day I gave notice at work that I would be quitting at Christmas. My boss, a man not given to offering unsolicited advice, told me he thought I was making a mistake by marrying Ted. He thought Ted was a nice guy, but too much of a climber to pay attention to my needs. I was annoyed. I called Angie and told her about my plans. "I sure hope you know what you're doing," she said. Now I was irritated that nobody seemed to be happy for me. On August 16th, I drove down to the Bundy's cabin on the lake to meet Ted's aunt, who was visiting from back east. During the course of a conversation, Ted's mother mentioned that Ted had given his little brother a bicycle the week before when he was visiting Ted in Salt Lake City. She talked about how hard it was to get it home on the plane. I only heard half of what she said. I had given Ted a choice between me and stealing. That bicycle had to be stolen. I left early and called Ted the minute I got home. No answer. I called all evening without getting him. The fact that he wasn't at home at 1 a.m. made me madder. I called him early the next morning and there was still no answer. I didn't get a hold of him until the next night. By this time I was furious. I waded into him about the bicycle. "I won't marry you unless you straighten yourself out," I told him. I expected him to defend himself, to try to make things right again, but he seemed confused about why I was so mad. He had been sleeping when I called and he seemed disoriented. As we talked, I became aware that he sounded relieved that I was mad enough to call off the wedding. Just before he hung up, he said, "I want you to know that I'll always love you." I lay down on the couch. I was so mad I was shaking, but at the same time I felt freer than I had in years. "You can just go to hell, Ted Bundy."